They called us the Forgotten Species in their galactic databases. A primitive civilization barely worth cataloging, stuck on a backwater planet in an unremarkable solar system. The Zephyrian Empire had conquered 17 star systems without breaking stride, absorbing advanced civilizations that had mastered faster-than-light travel millennia before humans discovered fire. Earth was supposed to be their easiest conquest yet, a simple resource grab from species that hadn't even colonized their own moon properly. The invasion fleet that arrived expected to face crude projectile weapons and chemical propulsion at best. What they found instead would shatter everything they believed about the nature of power, survival, and what it truly means to be apex predators in a hostile universe. The Zephyrians had studied our transmissions, analyzed our military capabilities, and calculated our surrender within 72 hours. They had conquered gods and devils across the galaxy, species with technology that could reshape matter and bend space-time itself. But they had never encountered humans. And they had no idea that the greatest weapon in the universe isn't technology. It's the absolute, terrifying refusal to surrender when everything rational says you should. They were about to learn why even the gods fear the species that climbs back up from hell just to spit in their faces. The first sign wasn't the massive ships that blotted out the sun over major cities. It wasn't the electromagnetic pulse that knocked out every satellite and most electronics across 3 continents. The first sign was the complete and utter silence from the Arecibo replacement facility in Puerto Rico, followed by every other deep space monitoring station going dark within minutes of each other. Dr. Sarah Chun had been monitoring the quantum resonance patterns from her lab at MIT when the readings went completely insane. The instruments were detecting energy signatures that shouldn't exist according to every law of physics she knew. She was still staring at the impossible data when her colleague Dr. Marcus Webb burst through the laboratory door, his face pale as death. "Sarah, you need to see this right now," he gasped, holding up his tablet with shaking hands. Every major news network, every amateur radio operator, every observatory in the Northern Hemisphere is reporting the same thing. The footage on his tablet made her blood run cold. Massive, crystalline structures were emerging from what appeared to be tiers in space itself, hovering motionless above New York, London, Tokyo, Beijing, and a dozen other major population centers. Each ship was easily 10 kilometers long, their surfaces reflecting light in patterns that hurt to look at directly. "How is this possible?" Sarah whispered, her scientific mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The energy required to create stable wormholes of that size should collapse into black holes. It violates everything we know about space-time manipulation. Marcus pulled up another feed on his tablet. "That's not the worst part. Look at this." The new video showed what appeared to be a communication array extending from the largest ship over New York City. As they watched, a beam of coherent light swept across the city below, and suddenly, every electronic screen, every radio, every communication device in the metropolitan area crackled to life with the same message. The voice that emerged was artificial, yet somehow organic, speaking in perfect English with an accent that seemed to shift and adapt in real time. "People of Earth, we are the Zephyrian Empire. Your planet has been selected for resource acquisition and population relocation. You have 72 hours to surrender your governing bodies and submit to imperial authority. Resistance will result in immediate termination of your species." Sarah and Marcus stared at each other in stunned silence. Around them, the laboratory's emergency systems began wailing as the university's backup generators kicked in. Through the windows, they could see students and faculty streaming out of buildings, many looking up at the sky where a faint shimmer betrayed the presence of something massive lurking beyond the clouds. "This has to be some kind of elaborate hoax," Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. The technology required for this kind of display, the coordination across multiple continents simultaneously. "Run a spectral analysis on those ships," Sarah ordered, her training taking over despite the shock. "If this is real, if those things are actually using exotic matter manipulation, we should be able to detect quantum field fluctuations unlike anything we've ever seen." As Marcus began configuring their instruments, Sarah pulled up the global communication networks that were still functioning. What she found made her stomach drop. Military installations worldwide were reporting complete systems failures. Nuclear early warning networks were offline. The International Space Station had gone silent. Even hardened military communication systems designed to survive electromagnetic pulses were functioning only intermittently. "Sarah," Marcus called out, his voice tight with fear. "The spectral analysis is complete. These energy signatures, they're not just advanced technology. They're manipulating fundamental forces we can barely theorize about. Matter conversion, temporal displacement, gravity manipulation on a scale that should require the energy output of an entire star." Before Sarah could respond, her phone buzzed with an emergency alert. Every person in the United States was receiving the same message from the federal government. All citizens were to remain calm, stay indoors, and await further instructions. Military personnel were being recalled to duty immediately. The president would address the nation within the hour. But even as she read the message, Sarah knew that conventional military responses would be useless against technology this advanced. Whatever species had built these ships was so far beyond human capabilities that resistance seemed not just futile, but laughably inadequate. She was wrong about that last part. 3 hours after the initial appearance of the Zephyrian fleet, the first human response came not from any government or military organization, but from a group of teenagers in Detroit who had somehow rigged a high-powered amateur radio setup to broadcast directly at the alien ships. "Hey, space assholes," the transmission began, delivered in the unmistakably casual tone of a 17-year-old who had grown up playing online games and wasn't particularly impressed by threats. "This is Earth calling. We got your little surrender demand, and we've got a counter-offer for you. How about you take your fancy light show and shove it where your sun doesn't shine? We didn't spend 10,000 years clawing our way to the top of the food chain just to roll over for some glowing disco balls." The transmission was picked up by emergency communication networks still functioning around the globe. Within minutes, similar messages were being broadcast from every continent. A farmer in rural Australia told the aliens to bugger off back to whatever rock they crawled out from under. A group of college students in Berlin suggested that the Zephyrians had clearly never experienced the joy of German engineering applied to the fine art of telling invaders to go to hell. In her laboratory, Sarah watched these responses with a mixture of horror and disbelief. "Are they insane?" she whispered. "These beings have technology that could probably sterilize the planet with a thought." But as she monitored the alien ships, something strange was happening. The Zephyrian vessels, which had maintained perfect formation since their arrival, were beginning to show subtle changes in their positioning. Long-range sensors detected energy spikes that suggested increased activity aboard the ships, almost as if the aliens were confused by the responses they were receiving. The answer to that confusion came 12 hours later, when the Zephyrians broadcast their second message to Earth. This time, the artificial voice carried an undertone that hadn't been present before, something that sounded almost like uncertainty. "People of Earth, your responses to our lawful claim over this planet are unprecedented in imperial records. In 400 years of expansion, no species has responded to surrender demands with insults and challenges to personal combat. We are forced to conclude that your communication methods may be malfunctioning due to primitive technology. We will allow additional time for your leaders to respond appropriately." The extended deadline was supposed to be 48 additional hours. The Zephyrians had assumed that once Earth's governments had time to assess the situation rationally, surrender would be swift and total. It was a pattern they had seen repeated across 17 star systems. Initial shock and disbelief, followed by desperate attempts at negotiation, and finally, the inevitable capitulation when the invaded species realized the hopelessness of their situation. They had never encountered a species that responded to overwhelming force by getting angry. By the end of the first day, governments around the world were indeed responding to the alien ultimatum. But instead of surrender terms, they were mobilizing every military asset they possessed. The United States began recalling troops from overseas deployments. Russia activated reserve forces that hadn't been assembled since World War II. China began converting civilian manufacturing to military production. The European Union invoked mutual defense clauses that brought together military forces from 30 countries. Even more disturbing to the Zephyrian observers were the non-governmental responses. Civilian militias were forming in rural areas across multiple continents. Hacker collectives were attempting to penetrate alien communication networks using techniques that, while primitive by imperial standards, were being applied in ways that no rational species would consider. Urban gangs were pooling resources to acquire military-grade weapons. Environmental protesters were converting their organizations into guerrilla warfare training camps. Most bewildering of all, humans were voluntarily destroying their own infrastructure to deny its use to the invaders. Critical bridges were being demolished. Fuel depots were being drained or destroyed. Data centers containing centuries of accumulated knowledge were being wiped clean rather than risk the information falling into alien hands. This species is exhibiting behavior patterns that contradict every model of rational self-preservation, reported Zephyrian Survey Commander Kethvar to the Imperial War Council via quantum transmission. They're sacrificing resources vital to their own survival rather than accept territorial concession. Their military responses suggest they intend to engage vessels capable of planetary annihilation using projectile weapons and chemical explosives. The response from High Command was swift and dismissive. Commander, you are observing the desperate flailing of a primitive species facing inevitable defeat. Proceed with standard occupation protocols. Resistance will collapse once they witness Imperial military capabilities. Kethvar was a veteran of dozens of conquest campaigns. He had overseen the subjugation of the Christarch Collective, beings of living mineral who could manipulate matter at the molecular level. He had directed the absorption of the Void Dancers, energy-based entities who existed partially outside normal space-time. Never in his extensive career had he encountered a species that responded to superior force by becoming more aggressive rather than more cooperative. But his orders were clear, and the timeline for Earth's integration into the Empire was already established. The resource extraction operations were scheduled to begin in 72 hours, with or without human cooperation. What Kethvar didn't understand, what no Zephyrian could understand, was that humans had spent their entire evolutionary history as persistence predators. They were the species that had driven megafauna to extinction not through superior strength or speed, but by simply refusing to give up the chase until their prey collapsed from exhaustion. They were the descendants of ancestors who had survived ice ages, supervolcanic eruptions, and global catastrophes by adapting, enduring, and fighting back against odds that should have meant certain extinction. The Zephyrians had conquered civilizations that possessed technology beyond human comprehension. But they had never faced a species whose primary evolutionary advantage was spite. As the deadline approached, reports from Zephyrian reconnaissance teams painted an increasingly disturbing picture of human preparations. Rather than concentrating their forces for conventional defensive actions, humans were dispersing into small, mobile groups that would be nearly impossible to eliminate efficiently. They were converting civilian vehicles into weapons platforms, repurposing industrial chemicals into explosive devices, and sharing information about alien weak points through communication networks that were somehow remaining functional despite repeated attempts to shut them down. Most troubling of all, humans were displaying a complete lack of concern for their own survival that bordered on the pathological. Volunteer units were forming specifically to carry out suicide attacks against Zephyrian forces. Parents were teaching their children to build improvised weapons. Elderly individuals were volunteering for missions that were explicitly described as one-way operations. They're not just refusing to surrender, Kethvar transmitted to High Command as his deadline approached. They're actively preparing to make occupation so costly that we may need to reassess the value of this world to the Empire. The response from Imperial Command was immediate and final. Commander, you will proceed with occupation as scheduled. The humans will submit or they will be eliminated. The Empire does not negotiate with primitive species regardless of their psychological abnormalities. As the 72-hour deadline expired, Kethvar began preparing for what he expected would be a brief and decisive demonstration of Imperial power. His tactical computers had calculated that once humans witnessed the true capabilities of Zephyrian military technology, organized resistance would collapse within hours. The computers had factored in human military capabilities, population density, infrastructure vulnerabilities, and resource distribution patterns. They had accounted for every variable that rational military planning would consider important. They had not accounted for the fact that humans were not rational. As the first Zephyrian landing craft descended toward Earth's surface, they were met not with surrender flags or desperate negotiations, but with surface-to-air missiles fired by operators who had been told explicitly that their weapons would have minimal effect against alien shields, and who had responded by loading extra missiles. The war for Earth was about to begin, and for the first time in 4 centuries of Imperial expansion, the outcome was not predetermined. The first Zephyrian landing craft touched down in Central Park at exactly 0800 hours Eastern Standard Time, its crystalline hull gleaming in the morning sun as curious New Yorkers gathered behind hastily erected police barriers. The ship was beautiful in an alien way, its surfaces flowing like liquid metal while maintaining perfect geometric precision. For a moment, there was an almost carnival atmosphere as people pulled out phones to record what they assumed would be first contact with an advanced alien civilization. That illusion lasted exactly 43 seconds. The landing craft's hull suddenly became transparent, revealing the interior packed with what could only be described as walking nightmares. The Zephyrian soldiers were tall, angular beings that seemed to be carved from living obsidian, their movements too fluid and too fast to be entirely organic. They carried weapons that hummed with barely contained energy, and their faces, if they could be called faces, showed no expression that any human could interpret as peaceful. The first human to die was a street vendor named Miguel Rodriguez, who had been selling hot dogs from his cart when the ship landed. He approached the emerging aliens with a smile and a greeting in both English and Spanish, apparently believing that food was a universal language of friendship. The nearest Zephyrian soldier examined him for approximately 2 seconds before disintegrating him with a casual gesture from its weapon. The screaming started immediately. But instead of running, something remarkable happened. A New York City police sergeant named Marie O'Brien, who had been maintaining crowd control, drew her service weapon and opened fire on the alien soldiers. Her 9mm round sparked harmlessly off their energy shields, but she kept firing until her magazine was empty, then drew her backup weapon and continued shooting while backing toward civilian positions. NYPD, everyone back. Move, 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 she shouted, placing herself between the aliens and fleeing civilians while her bullets accomplished nothing except announcing that humans were not going to die quietly. Her stand lasted less than 10 seconds before an alien energy weapon reduced her to ash. But those 10 seconds gave hundreds of people enough time to escape the immediate kill zone. More importantly, those 10 seconds were broadcast live on dozens of phones and social media feeds, showing the world exactly what humanity was facing and exactly how at least one human had chosen to respond. The footage spread across every available network within minutes. A NYPD sergeant with a useless pistol standing against impossible odds to protect innocent people. It should have been an image of hopeless defiance, but somehow it became something else entirely. A declaration of intent. Similar scenes played out simultaneously in a dozen cities as Zephyrian forces began their occupation operations. In London, a group of football hooligans armed with nothing but broken bottles and cricket bats charged alien soldiers in Trafalgar Square, managing to damage one of their energy shields through sheer persistence before being overwhelmed. In Tokyo, an elderly sushi chef named Akira Tanaka used his kitchen knives to attack aliens who entered his restaurant, somehow managing to injure one of them before being killed. Each individual action was militarily insignificant. Each human who died accomplished nothing tactically meaningful against the overwhelming technological superiority of their enemies. But, collectively, they sent a message that reached every Zephyrian commander monitoring the invasion. Humans would fight with anything they could find, against any odds, until they were physically incapable of continuing. Commander Kethvar watched the reports flooding in from his landing teams with growing unease. His tactical computers had predicted civilian casualties during the initial occupation phase, but they had not predicted civilian resistance. Most species, when faced with the demonstrated power of Imperial forces, focused their energies on negotiating terms of surrender that would minimize further loss of life. Humans seem to be doing the opposite. Instead of seeking to minimize casualties, they were maximizing their resistance efforts regardless of cost. Worse, each act of defiance seemed to inspire others rather than discourage them. "Command, this is Landing Team 7, came a transmission from the forces occupying Berlin. We are encountering organized civilian resistance at every objective. Subjects are using improvised weapons and showing no regard for personal survival. Request clarification on rules of engagement." Before Kethvar could respond, another transmission interrupted. "Command, Landing Team 12 in Mumbai. Local population has constructed barricades and is using industrial chemicals as weapons. They appear to be coordinating through communication networks we cannot intercept. Our casualties are minimal, but progress is significantly slower than projected. The reports continued flooding in. Sydney, human civilians were using construction equipment as improvised weapons. Mexico City, local gangs had allied with police forces and were conducting coordinated attacks against landing sites. Sao Paulo, humans were deliberately destroying infrastructure to complicate occupation efforts. But it was the report from Moscow that made Kethvar's blood run cold. Command, this is Landing Team 3. We have secured Red Square, but encountered an unexpected situation. Local human military forces retreated from our advance, but they left behind what appeared to be explosive devices. When our advance team investigated, they were targeted by concealed human snipers. The explosives were not intended to damage our forces. They were intended to draw us into kill zones where humans with projectile weapons were waiting. Kethvar studied the tactical display, showing all of his landing team's positions. What he saw there violated every principle of logical military response he understood. Instead of concentrating their forces for maximum defensive effectiveness, humans were spreading out across maximum area, forcing his own troops to divide their attention across dozens of small, mobile threats. Instead of preserving their most advanced weapons for critical engagements, they were using everything they had immediately, as if they expected to have no use for equipment they might need later. Instead of establishing secure command structures to coordinate resistance, they were operating in small, independent groups that could continue functioning even if larger units were eliminated. It was Kethvar realized exactly how a species would behave if they assumed they were going to lose, and were focused entirely on making victory as expensive as possible for their conquerors. That realization was crystallizing in his mind when the first reports reached him of human military responses to the invasion. Unlike the civilian resistance, which was chaotic and unpredictable, human military forces were following doctrines that were clearly prepared in advance. The United States military response began with the simultaneous launch of every intercontinental ballistic missile in their arsenal, targeted not at population centers, but directly at Zephyrian ships in orbit. The missiles carried nuclear warheads, but also more exotic payloads, experimental electromagnetic pulse weapons, kinetic penetrators designed to pierce advanced armor, and experimental directed energy weapons that pushed the limits of human technology. None of them penetrated Zephyrian defensive systems, but they forced the orbital fleet to activate shields and defensive measures that had been held in reserve. More importantly, they announced to every Zephyrian ship in orbit that humans possessed weapons capable of ending all life on their own planet, and were willing to use them. The naval response was even more aggressive. Every nuclear submarine in the world's oceans had received the same orders. Surface immediately and launch everything you have at alien positions. Then proceed to designated coordinates for guerrilla operations. Aircraft carriers that should have been protecting themselves from alien retaliation were instead launching every plane they carried in simultaneous strikes against landing zones. They're not fighting to win, Kethvar transmitted to High Command. They're fighting to ensure that conquest is unacceptably costly. Their entire strategy appears based on the assumption that we will eventually decide this planet is not worth the resources required to pacify it. The response from Imperial Command was swift and harsh. Commander, you are allowing primitive psychology to cloud your tactical judgment. Increase pressure on population centers. Once these humans witness the true cost of resistance, their leadership will capitulate. But Kethvar was beginning to understand something that Imperial Command, safe in their distant star systems, could not grasp. Humans didn't seem to have the kind of centralized leadership that could order capitulation. Their resistance was emerging from millions of individual decisions made by beings who had concluded that surrender was worse than death. That understanding became even clearer when Zephyrian forces began targeting civilian population centers to break human morale. Energy weapons capable of leveling city blocks were turned on refugee columns. Orbital bombardment destroyed major infrastructure hubs. Civilians were given explicit ultimatums: surrender or face extermination. The human response was to evacuate population centers not away from the fighting, but deeper into terrain where Zephyrian forces would be forced to fight on foot. Urban centers became honey traps where human forces could draw alien soldiers into prepared kill zones. Rural areas became staging grounds for guerrilla operations that targeted any Zephyrian force small enough to be engaged with available weapons. Most disturbing to Zephyrian observers was the human practice of booby-trapping their own critical infrastructure. Hospitals were rigged with explosives so that any attempt to seize them would result in their destruction. Food distribution centers were similarly prepared. Humans seemed willing to deny themselves resources rather than allow those resources to be used by occupying forces. "Sir," reported Kethvar's chief intelligence officer, "we are seeing behavioral patterns that suggest this species may be incapable of surrender. Their responses to increasingly severe pressure are becoming more extreme rather than more cooperative." Kethvar studied the latest reports from his ground forces. 3 days into the occupation, Zephyrian forces controlled most major urban centers, but those centers were largely empty of humans and resources. The population had dispersed into smaller communities that were harder to locate and more difficult to control. Worse, every day brought reports of new forms of human resistance. In the Amazon basin, humans were using their knowledge of local terrain to conduct attacks on Zephyrian patrols, then disappearing in a jungle that was too dense for aerial pursuit. In the Siberian wilderness, Russian forces had established underground bases that were invisible to orbital reconnaissance and were coordinating strikes across thousands of kilometers of frozen wasteland. But it was the reports from urban areas that truly concerned Kethvar. Humans trapped in occupied cities weren't surrendering or fleeing. They were going underground, literally. Sewer systems, subway tunnels, basement complexes, and abandoned buildings were being connected into networks that allowed human forces to move undetected beneath Zephyrian positions. Every building that aliens occupied became a potential target for attacks from below, above, or from unexpected angles. "Commander," transmitted Landing Team 5 from Paris, "we are encountering significant resistance from human forces operating within the infrastructure of this city. They appear to have prepared for urban warfare by creating tunnels, supply caches, and communication networks that we cannot easily detect. Every building we secure becomes a potential staging ground for counterattacks." The situation was similar across every major population center. Humans had not just prepared for invasion. They had prepared for occupation. They had studied their own cities and identified every possible advantage they could leverage against technologically superior occupying forces. They had planned for a type of warfare that most rational species would consider suicidal. That was when Kethvar began receiving reports that made him question whether the species was entirely sane. Human forces were deliberately targeting their own communications and transportation infrastructure to prevent Zephyrian forces from using it. They were destroying bridges, flooding tunnels, and demolishing roads to limit alien mobility. They were poisoning water supplies and contaminating food stores to deny resources to occupying forces. Most incredibly, they were destroying their own museums, libraries, and cultural centers rather than risk having their history and knowledge fall into alien hands. Archaeological sites were being dynamited. Art galleries were being emptied and their contents scattered or destroyed. Universities were wiping their research databases clean. They're systematically erasing their own civilization, Kethvar's cultural analysis officer reported. Rather than preserve their achievements for integration into the empire, they're choosing to lose everything they have built rather than see it used by conquerors. It was a level of spite that no Zephyrian strategist had planned for. Their occupation protocols assumed that conquered species would want to preserve some aspects of their culture and society under imperial rule. The concept of a species that would rather destroy everything they had built than allow it to be absorbed by conquerors was so alien that it didn't appear in any imperial manual. As the first week of occupation drew to a close, Kethvar's forces controlled approximately 60% of Earth's landmass and had eliminated roughly 30% of organized human military resistance. By imperial standards, the campaign was proceeding successfully, if somewhat slower than projected. But Kethvar was beginning to understand that traditional measures of success were meaningless in this context. The humans weren't fighting to control territory or preserve assets. They weren't trying to maintain organized government or protect critical infrastructure. They were fighting to make the cost of holding Earth higher than the value of the resources it contained. And by that measure, they were succeeding. His supply lines were under constant attack. His communications networks were being disrupted by human hackers using techniques that were primitive but unpredictable. His ground forces were taking casualties not from advanced weapons, but from humans who had rigged their own bodies with explosives and were walking into Zephyrian positions without any attempt to escape afterward. High Command, HFY transmitted, "I am requesting immediate reinforcement of occupation forces and revision of strategic objectives. This species is not responding to conquest according to any established Imperial model. Recommend implementation of planetary sterilization protocols as most efficient method of resource extraction." The response took longer than usual, suggesting that his reports were being reviewed at the highest levels of Imperial authority. When the answer came, it carried the authority of the Emperor himself. "Commander HFY, the Empire does not retreat from primitive species regardless of their psychological abnormalities. You will complete occupation of this planet using whatever force is necessary. Failure is not acceptable." As he closed the communication channel, HFY looked out at the darkening sky, where dozens of human aircraft were conducting what appeared to be a suicide mission against his orbital fleet. They had no hope of penetrating Zephyrian shields, but they kept coming anyway, forcing his defensive systems to expend energy and ammunition on targets that should have retreated after their first attacks failed. He was beginning to suspect that the Empire had made a fundamental error in choosing to conquer this particular planet. But his orders were clear, and Imperial discipline was absolute. The question was whether humans would run out of ways to make his life difficult before his superiors ran out of patience with the results he was achieving. 2 weeks into the occupation, Commander HFY received a report that fundamentally changed his understanding of what his forces were facing. It came from Survey Team Delta, which had been sent to investigate what appeared to be a major human military installation in the Rocky Mountains of North America. "Command, we have discovered something unprecedented," transmitted Team Leader Vextal. This installation was not a military base. It was a civilian research facility dedicated to studying Zephyrian technology based on our previous conquest campaigns. They have been analyzing our tactics, weapons, and defensive systems for years before we arrived at this planet. HFY stared at the intelligence data flooding his command screens. Deep within a mountain complex that had been disguised as a mining operation, human scientists and engineers have been working systematically to identify weaknesses in Zephyrian military technology. They had studied footage of Imperial operations on other worlds, analyzed debris from space battles, and somehow acquired detailed specifications for standard Zephyrian equipment. "How is this possible?" HFY demanded. "Our invasion of this system was classified at the highest levels of Imperial security. These humans should have had no advance warning of our intentions." The answer, when it came, was worse than he had feared. Humans had not received advance warning of a Zephyrian invasion. Instead, they had been preparing for the possibility of alien conquest for decades. Their entire military-industrial complex had been quietly developing contingency plans for fighting technologically superior enemies, and they had been doing it using the same persistence and resourcefulness they applied to every other challenge they faced. The mountain facility contained detailed technical manuals for improvised weapons designed specifically to exploit Zephyrian vulnerabilities. Electromagnetic pulse devices that could temporarily disrupt alien shields. Kinetic projectiles designed to penetrate Zephyrian armor at specific angles. Chemical compounds that interfered with the exotic matter manipulation that powered Imperial technology. But the most disturbing discovery was a series of documents outlining human strategic philosophy for resisting technologically superior invaders. The plans assumed from the beginning that Earth could not win a conventional military victory against advanced alien forces. Instead, they focused entirely on making occupation economically and militarily unsustainable. "They call it asymmetric warfare," reported Vextal. "The strategic goal is not to defeat our forces, but to ensure that maintaining control over this planet costs more resources than the planet can provide. Every tactical decision is made with the assumption that victory is impossible and that the only viable objective is making conquest and profitable." HFY reviewed the captured documents with growing alarm. Human planners had identified exactly which Imperial resources were most difficult to replace and had developed strategies for targeting those specific vulnerabilities. They understood that Zephyrian forces depended on complex supply chains stretching across multiple star systems, and they were systematically attacking every link in those chains. More disturbing was the revelation that humans have been sharing these tactical concepts through their global communication networks since the invasion began. Every successful attack against Zephyrian forces was being analyzed, documented, and replicated by resistance groups across the planet. The knowledge base that had been developed in secret facilities was now being distributed to anyone willing to use it. "Sir," reported his intelligence chief, "we are detecting significant changes in human resistance patterns. Their attacks are becoming more sophisticated and more coordinated. They appear to be adapting their tactics faster than our countermeasures can be developed." The evidence was overwhelming. In the Amazon, human forces were using modified industrial equipment to create electromagnetic fields that disrupted Zephyrian communications. In urban areas, resistance groups were employing chemical weapons specifically designed to corrode alien armor materials. Mountain fighters were using the planet's magnetic field in combination with metallic projectiles to create kinetic attacks that could penetrate energy shields. Each new tactic was being developed by human engineers who had never seen Zephyrian technology directly, but who were working from technical specifications shared by whoever had managed to capture and analyze Imperial equipment. The speed of innovation was unprecedented in Kethvar's experience with primitive species. But the tactical improvements were only part of the problem. The deeper issue was that humans were demonstrating an institutional capacity for warfare that Imperial analysts had completely underestimated. Their resistance was not the desperate flailing of a doomed species, but the systematic application of strategic principles that had been refined through centuries of conflict against each other. They have been preparing for this type of war for their entire recorded history. Vextal transmitted from the capture facility. These beings have spent thousands of years fighting technologically superior enemies and developing methods for overcoming superior force through persistence, deception, and tactical innovation. Every conflict in their history appears to have been a training exercise for exactly this type of asymmetric engagement. Kethvar was forced to confront an uncomfortable reality. Humans were not fighting the Zephyrian Empire the way most species fought Imperial forces. They were fighting the way they had always fought, with complete disregard for conventional military wisdom and total commitment to making their enemies pay the maximum possible price for every objective achieved. That understanding became even clearer when Kethvar received reports about human psychological operations. Instead of trying to hide their casualties or maintain morale through false optimism, humans were broadcasting detailed accounts of every death, every destroyed city, every tactical defeat they suffered. But they were presenting these losses not as reasons to surrender, but as evidence of Zephyrian brutality that justified increasingly extreme resistance measures. "They're using our military success against us," reported a psychological warfare specialist. "Every demonstration of Imperial power is being used to recruit additional resistance fighters. Their communication networks are filled with messages encouraging revenge for fallen comrades and promising that every human death will be repaid with interest." The propaganda was remarkably effective because it was essentially truthful. Zephyrian forces were killing humans in large numbers, destroying human infrastructure, and implementing increasingly harsh occupation policies. Instead of hiding these facts, human resistance leaders were broadcasting them as proof that surrender would lead to extinction rather than survival. Most disturbing to Kethvar was the revelation that humans were using their own casualties as strategic weapons. Resistance groups were deliberately selecting targets that would result in maximum loss of human life, while inflicting minimum damage to Zephyrian forces, specifically to create martyrs whose deaths could be used to justify escalating the conflict. They're sacrificing their own people to maintain popular support for resistance operations, his analyst reported. Each civilian death is being used to recruit additional fighters who are motivated by personal loss rather than abstract political objectives. The tactic was so contrary to rational self-preservation that it took Kethvar several days to understand its effectiveness. Humans were not trying to minimize casualties. They were trying to maximize the emotional impact of casualties to fuel continued resistance. Every funeral became a recruitment rally. Every destroyed neighborhood became a symbol of why the fight had to continue regardless of cost. As the occupation entered its third week, Kethvar's strategic position was becoming increasingly complicated. His forces controlled most major population centers, but those centers were largely empty. The human population had dispersed into smaller communities that were harder to locate and more difficult to manage. Worse, the scattered population was proving to be more effective at resistance operations than concentrated urban groups had been. Rural resistance networks were using their knowledge of local terrain to conduct attacks that were impossible to predict or prevent. Mountain communities were establishing supply lines that could support guerrilla operations indefinitely. Coastal populations were using fishing boats and recreational vessels to maintain communications between resistance groups while staying below the threshold of Imperial attention. "Sir," reported his logistics commander, "our supply requirements are exceeding projections by 40%. The need to maintain security at every installation is forcing us to allocate resources to defensive positions that are not generating any strategic value." The mathematics of occupation were becoming problematic. Every Zephyrian soldier assigned to guard duty was a soldier who could not be used for offensive operations. Every transport convoy required escorts that reduced the efficiency of resource extraction. Every communication relay needed protection from sabotage attempts that were increasing in frequency and sophistication. Worse, human resistance groups were demonstrating an uncanny ability to identify and target exactly those Imperial installations that were most difficult to replace or repair. Power generation facilities, communication hubs, and supply depots were being attacked with precision that suggested detailed intelligence about Zephyrian vulnerabilities. They're prioritizing targets based on our tactical requirements rather than their symbolic value, reported his security chief. Instead of attacking installations that would provide propaganda value, they're focusing on infrastructure that supports our military operations. The targeting strategy was devastatingly effective because it forced Zephyrian commanders to choose between protecting essential installations and maintaining offensive pressure against human resistance groups. Every installation that required additional security was a drain on resources that could otherwise be used to expand Imperial control. It was during the 4th week of occupation that Kethvar encountered the most disturbing aspect of human resistance psychology. A captured human fighter, when interrogated about the futility of continued resistance, had provided an answer that haunted every Zephyrian officer who heard it. "You think we're fighting to win," the human had said, blood streaming from wounds that would have incapacitated most species. "You're wrong. We're fighting to make sure that when this is over, every species in the galaxy knows exactly what it costs to invade Earth. We're fighting so that the next aliens who show up here will have to ask themselves whether they want to go through what you're going through." The statement revealed a strategic perspective that extended far beyond the current conflict. Humans were not just fighting the Zephyrian Empire. They were fighting to establish a reputation that would discourage future invasions by any species. They were using their current suffering as an investment in long-term planetary security. They view this conflict as a form of interstellar deterrence, Kethvar's strategic analyst explained. Their objective is not victory in this engagement, but ensuring that the cost of conquering Earth becomes a cautionary tale told throughout the galaxy. The insight explained much about human tactical decisions that had previously seemed irrational. Their willingness to sacrifice resources and personnel made sense if the goal was to demonstrate that Earth was more trouble than it was worth. Their escalating resistance tactics were designed to ensure that any species considering invasion would have detailed information about the price that such an operation would extract. As reports continued arriving from resistance operations across the planet, Kethvar began to understand that he was not just fighting to conquer Earth. He was fighting to preserve the reputation of the Zephyrian Empire as an unstoppable conquest force. If humans succeeded in making occupation economically unsustainable, the news would spread throughout Imperial space and potentially encourage resistance movements on other conquered worlds. The strategic implications were sobering. The Empire had built its expansion on the assumption that overwhelming technological superiority would ensure swift and efficient conquest of primitive species. If humans demonstrated that advanced technology could not guarantee successful occupation, it would undermine the basic strategic doctrine that had driven Imperial expansion for centuries. "High Command," Kethvar transmitted, "I am requesting immediate strategic review of occupation objectives. Human resistance is proving more costly than anticipated, and their tactical innovations are beginning to spread to other theaters of operation. Recommend consideration of alternative approaches to resource extraction that do not require permanent occupation." The response was swift and harsh. Commander, the Empire does not modify strategic objectives based on the complaints of primitive species. You will complete occupation as ordered. Additional forces are being dispatched to support your operations. But as Kethvar reviewed the reinforcement schedules, he realized that High Command was making the same mistake he had made at the beginning of the campaign. They were applying more force to a problem that was not fundamentally about force levels. They were escalating a conflict with a species that seemed to become more dangerous as the stakes increased. Looking out at the scarred landscape of what had once been a thriving human city, Kethvar wondered if the Zephyrian Empire had finally encountered a species that could not be conquered by conventional means. The humans were losing every battle, but somehow the war was becoming more expensive for the victors than the defeated. He was beginning to suspect that humans had discovered something that no other species in the galaxy understood. Sometimes the best way to win a war is to make sure your enemy regrets starting it. The turning point came not with a dramatic battle or strategic breakthrough, but with a single transmission from the Deep Space Monitoring Station at the edge of the solar system. Commander Kethvar was reviewing casualty reports when his communications officer suddenly went rigid with shock. "Sir, we are receiving an emergency transmission from the outer system perimeter. Long-range sensors have detected multiple fleet signatures approaching Earth at superluminal velocities." Kethvar's blood went cold. "Zephyrian reinforcements?" "Negative, sir. The energy signatures are not Imperial. We are detecting at least 3 distinct technology types, none of which match any known Imperial or human capabilities. Estimated time to arrival, 6 hours." The tactical display lit up with incoming trajectory data that made no immediate sense. The approaching vessels were using faster-than-light technologies that were fundamentally different from Zephyrian hyperdrive systems. More disturbing, they were approaching from multiple vectors simultaneously, suggesting coordinated arrival of separate fleets. Communications: attempt contact with approaching vessels. Standard Imperial protocols for unidentified craft in contested space. The response came back within minutes, and it was not what any Zephyrian officer wanted to hear. 3 separate alien species were responding to human transmissions that had been broadcast into deep space during the first weeks of the invasion. The messages had been simple. Earth was under attack by technologically superior forces and was requesting assistance from any species willing to provide it. "Sir," reported his communications officer, "the approaching fleets are identifying themselves as the Corvin Confederacy, the Ethereal Collective, and the Vanguard Alliance. They're stating that they received human distress signals and are responding under what they call galactic mutual aid protocols." Kethvar stared at the tactical display in disbelief. In 4 centuries of Imperial expansion, no conquered species had ever successfully appealed for aid from other galactic civilizations. The few attempts that had been made had been easily intercepted and neutralized before reaching potential allies. How did human transmissions reach these species without Imperial detection? He demanded. The answer, when it came from his intelligence staff, revealed another layer of human preparation that Imperial analysts had failed to anticipate. Humans had been broadcasting radio signals into space for over a century before the Zephyrian invasion. Among those signals were detailed information about human culture, technology, and history. More importantly, they had been broadcasting mathematical and scientific concepts that any sufficiently advanced species would recognize as evidence of intelligence. The humans established communication protocols decades before our arrival, his analyst reported. When the invasion began, they immediately began transmitting distress signals using these established protocols. The signals were embedded in civilian communication traffic and appear to be random electromagnetic noise to our monitoring systems. But the truly disturbing revelation was what human messages had contained. Rather than simply calling for military assistance, they had transmitted detailed tactical analyses of Zephyrian capabilities, strategic assessments of Imperial expansion patterns, and intelligence about Zephyrian occupation methods on other worlds. They provided other species with complete information about our military doctrine, technological capabilities, and strategic objectives, the intelligence chief continued. These transmissions were essentially detailed intelligence briefings about Imperial operations provided to any species capable of receiving them. The implications were staggering. For the first time in Imperial history, other galactic civilizations had been given advance warning about Zephyrian expansion and detailed information about how to counter Imperial technology. Human resistance to the occupation had been buying time not just for their own world, but for potential allies to prepare responses to Imperial aggression. "Sir," transmitted his deep space monitoring team, "we are receiving additional communications from the approaching fleets. They are requesting permission to enter the solar system to provide humanitarian aid to Earth's population and to establish formal diplomatic contact with the Zephyrian Empire." Kethvar understood immediately that the strategic situation had shifted beyond anything Imperial doctrine had prepared him for. 3 separate alien civilizations were approaching Earth not as potential conquest targets, but as allies responding to human calls for assistance. The precedent this would establish for Imperial expansion was catastrophic. "High Command," he transmitted, requesting immediate strategic guidance. "Multiple alien fleets are approaching Earth in response to human distress calls. The humans have somehow established diplomatic contact with other galactic civilizations and provided them with detailed intelligence about Imperial operations." The response from Imperial Command was swift, but revealed a level of panic that Kethvar had never heard in official transmissions. "Commander, you will prevent alien interference in Imperial operations by any means necessary. Use of maximum force is authorized. Under no circumstances are alien species to be allowed to establish formal contact with human resistance forces." But as Kethvar reviewed his available assets, he realized that his forces were not positioned to prevent the arrival of 3 separate alien fleets. His orbital assets were already stretched to maintain control over Earth's population centers and protect supply lines from constant human attacks. His ground forces were committed to occupation duties and could not be withdrawn without losing territory that had been costly to secure. More importantly, the approaching alien fleets were broadcasting on open channels that could be received by human resistance groups across Earth. The knowledge that help was coming was spreading through human communication networks faster than Imperial forces could interfere with the transmissions. "Sir," reported his intelligence chief, "human resistance activity is increasing dramatically across all theaters. They appear to be coordinating a planet-wide operation timed to coincide with the arrival of alien assistance." The coordination was remarkable for a species that had been fighting with improvised tactics and minimal central authority. Somehow, human resistance groups were implementing a synchronized strategy that would put maximum pressure on Zephyrian forces exactly when those forces would be most vulnerable to outside interference. Urban resistance cells began simultaneous uprisings in every major occupied city. Rural guerrilla groups launched coordinated attacks on Imperial supply lines. Coastal populations used their fishing fleets to begin evacuating civilians from areas likely to become battlefields when the alien fleets arrived. But the most disturbing development was that humans were broadcasting detailed information about Zephyrian force dispositions, tactical capabilities, and strategic objectives directly to the approaching alien fleets. They were providing real-time intelligence that would allow hostile forces to target Imperial vulnerabilities with precision. "They're conducting reconnaissance operations on our behalf," Kethvar realized with growing horror. "Human resistance groups are identifying our critical installations and transmitting targeting data to incoming hostile fleets." The first alien fleet arrived in the outer solar system exactly as predicted, and its technology immediately demonstrated capabilities that matched or exceeded Imperial standards. The Corvin Confederacy vessels used gravity manipulation systems that allowed them to change course and acceleration in ways that Zephyrian tactical computers struggled to predict. "Sir, the Corvin fleet is broadcasting a formal diplomatic message to Imperial forces," his communications officer reported. "They are requesting immediate cessation of hostile actions against Earth's population and offering to mediate a peaceful resolution to the conflict." The offer was exactly what Imperial doctrine was designed to prevent. If the Zephyrian Empire began negotiating with other galactic civilizations about the terms of conquest, it would establish precedents that could undermine Imperial authority throughout occupied space. Every subjected species would begin appealing for outside intervention in Imperial operations. "Transmit standard Imperial response to interference in lawful conquest operations," Kethvar ordered. "All alien vessels will withdraw from this system immediately or be considered hostile and engaged accordingly." The Corvin response was immediate and delivered with diplomatic precision that revealed extensive preparation. "Commander Kethvar, the Corvin Confederacy does not recognize Zephyrian claims of sovereignty over inhabited worlds whose populations have not consented to Imperial authority. We are operating under galactic law regarding assistance to species facing extinction. The mention of galactic law was particularly disturbing because it suggested the existence of legal frameworks that the Zephyrian Empire had not previously encountered. Imperial expansion had always proceeded on the assumption that technological superiority established legitimate authority over primitive species. "Sir," reported his strategic analyst, "we are detecting similar diplomatic transmissions from the other approaching fleets. The Ethereal Collective and Vanguard Alliance are both citing legal precedents for intervention in cases of genocide or species extinction." As the alien fleets took positions around Earth, their combined technological capabilities became clear. Each civilization brought different strategic advantages. The Corvin Confederacy specialized in gravity manipulation and kinetic weapons. The Ethereal Collective used exotic energy systems that could disrupt Imperial shields, and the Vanguard Alliance employed swarm tactics with thousands of small, highly maneuverable craft. But, more importantly, their arrival demonstrated that the human strategy of using resistance as a form of interstellar communication had succeeded beyond Imperial calculations. Earth's desperate fight against overwhelming odds had not gone unnoticed by other galactic civilizations, and humanity's tactical innovations were being studied and adapted by species with the technology to implement them effectively. "Commander," transmitted the lead Vanguard Alliance vessel, "we have received extensive technical briefings from Earth's population regarding Zephyrian military capabilities. We are prepared to provide immediate assistance to human resistance operations unless Imperial forces withdraw from this system voluntarily." Kethvar found himself facing a strategic nightmare that had no precedent in Imperial history. 3 alien fleets, with combined capabilities that rivaled his own forces, were offering military assistance to human resistance groups that already knew exactly how to exploit Zephyrian vulnerabilities. The tactical situation had shifted from manageable occupation to potential multi-species warfare. But perhaps most disturbing was the realization that humans had somehow anticipated this exact scenario. Their resistance strategy had been designed from the beginning not just to make occupation costly, but to buy time for outside intervention to arrive. They had been fighting to hold out long enough for help to come, and they had been broadcasting exactly the information their potential allies would need to be effective. "High Command," Kethvar transmitted, "the strategic situation has become untenable. Human resistance has successfully established contact with multiple alien civilizations, and those civilizations are now offering military support for continued resistance operations. Recommend immediate consideration of strategic alternatives to occupation." The response from Imperial Command revealed that Kethvar's superiors were finally beginning to understand what they were facing. "Commander, you are authorized to implement any tactical measures necessary to maintain Imperial control. The precedent of alien intervention and lawful conquest cannot be allowed to establish itself." But as Kethvar reviewed his options, he realized that every choice available to him would result in outcomes that were worse for the Empire than withdrawal. Engaging 3 alien fleets simultaneously would risk not just tactical defeat, but the possibility that Imperial military capabilities would be studied and countered by multiple species. Escalating occupation operations against human civilians while alien observers were present would provide evidence of Imperial brutality that could be used to justify intervention in other Imperial territories. Negotiating with alien species would establish precedents that would encourage resistance movements throughout occupied space. As reports continued arriving from across Earth's surface, Kethvar began to understand that humans had accomplished something unprecedented in galactic history. They had used their own suffering as a weapon to recruit allies for a cause that transcended their own survival. They had turned a planetary invasion into a galactic diplomatic crisis that threatened the fundamental assumptions underlying Imperial expansion. Looking at the tactical display showing alien fleets positioning themselves between his forces and Earth, Kethvar realized that the humans had achieved their strategic objective. They had made the conquest of Earth more expensive than the planet was worth, not just in immediate military terms, but in the precedent it would establish for the Empire's relationship with the broader galactic community. The question was no longer whether Zephyrian forces could complete the occupation of Earth. The question was whether the Empire could afford the galactic consequences of continuing the attempt. The final confrontation began not with weapons fire or diplomatic ultimatums, but with a transmission from Earth's surface that reached every ship in the solar system simultaneously. It came from a makeshift radio station hidden in the ruins of what had once been New York City, broadcast by a 12-year-old girl named Emma Chun, daughter of the MIT physicist who had first detected the alien arrival. This is Emma Chun, speaking for the free people of Earth to everyone listening across the galaxy. Her voice carried with remarkable clarity despite the improvised equipment. Our world is dying, our cities are burning, and millions of our people are dead. The Zephyrian Empire came here believing they could take our planet because we are primitive and weak. They were wrong about one thing. We are not primitive. We are exactly as strong as we need to be. Commander Kethvar listened to the transmission with growing unease. Intelligence reports indicated that human resistance groups had coordinated this broadcast to reach not just the alien fleets surrounding Earth, but deep space monitoring networks throughout the local galactic region. We want everyone in the galaxy to know what happened here, the girl continued. We want you to know that when the Zephyrians came, we did not surrender. We did not beg for mercy. We did not offer to serve them in exchange for our lives. We looked at their ships and their weapons and their threats, and we told them to go to hell. The broadcast was being received by alien vessels from 3 different civilizations, but more importantly, it was being recorded and transmitted throughout galactic communication networks by those civilizations. Emma Chen's words were being heard by species across the local stellar neighborhood, many of whom had never heard of humans before the Zephyrian invasion. They have better technology than us, she said. They have weapons we cannot match and ships we cannot build. They could destroy our cities and kill our people. But they cannot make us submit. They cannot make us serve them. They cannot make us stop fighting. And now you all know that they tried. Kethvar realized that he was listening to something that would be remembered throughout galactic history. This transmission would be studied by military strategists, diplomatic theorists, and resistance movements for centuries to come. A human child was creating a historical document that would define how the galaxy viewed both Earth and the Zephyrian Empire. We are not asking you to save us, Emma continued. We are asking you to remember us. Remember that when aliens with advanced technology came to conquer a primitive world, the primitives refused to be conquered. Remember that being technologically superior does not make you better than the people you are trying to conquer. Remember that some things are worth dying for, and freedom is the most important one. The transmission ended, but its impact was immediate and devastating to Zephyrian strategic objectives. The alien fleets surrounding Earth began broadcasting the recording throughout their respective territories. Human resistance had successfully created a galactic propaganda victory that completely reversed the narrative of imperial conquest. Sir, reported Kethvar's intelligence officer, we are receiving diplomatic communications from 17 different galactic civilizations. They are all requesting clarification about imperial intentions regarding Earth and expressing concern about Zephyrian expansion policies. The diplomatic crisis was spreading beyond anything imperial strategists had anticipated. Species that had never been contacted by the Zephyrian Empire were suddenly aware of imperial expansion and were coordinating responses to what they perceived as a threat to galactic stability. But the immediate tactical situation was becoming even more problematic. Human resistance groups were using the presence of alien observers to escalate their operations in ways that ensured maximum visibility for their cause. Instead of hiding their activities from alien fleets, they were deliberately conducting operations where they could be observed and recorded. Command, this is Ground Team 7, transmitted one of his occupation forces. Human resistance fighters are conducting coordinated attacks against our positions while alien vessels are monitoring from orbit. They appear to be timing operations to ensure that alien observers witness Zephyrian responses to resistance activities. The tactical implications were staggering. Humans were using their own casualties as evidence for alien witnesses of Zephyrian brutality. Every defensive measure that Imperial forces took against human attacks was being documented and transmitted throughout the galactic community as proof of Imperial aggression. They are weaponizing our military responses, Kethvar realized. Every action we take to defend our positions becomes propaganda evidence of Imperial oppression. The strategy was devastatingly effective because it exploited a fundamental weakness in Imperial doctrine. Zephyrian forces were trained to respond to resistance with overwhelming force designed to discourage further opposition. But when alien observers were present to document those responses, overwhelming force became evidence of exactly the kind of barbaric behavior that galactic civilization was supposedly designed to prevent. "Sir," transmitted his orbital fleet commander, "the alien vessels are repositioning to provide better observation capabilities for surface operations. They're not engaging our forces, but they're clearly documenting everything we do." As the standoff continued, reports began reaching Kethvar about developments beyond Earth that were far more threatening to Imperial interests than anything happening in the Sol system. Human transmissions had not just reached the 3 fleets currently observing Earth. They had been received by civilizations throughout the local galactic region, and those civilizations were beginning to coordinate responses to Imperial expansion. "High Command," he transmitted, "intelligence reports indicate that human distress signals have reached at least 43 separate galactic civilizations. These species are beginning to organize diplomatic and potentially military responses to Imperial expansion policies." The response from Imperial Command revealed that Kethvar superiors were finally beginning to understand the true scope of what humans had accomplished. "Commander, we are receiving similar reports from other Imperial territories. Subject species throughout occupied space are attempting to establish communication with outside civilizations using human communication protocols. This precedent cannot be allowed to establish itself." But as reports continued flooding in, it became clear that the precedent had already been established. Human resistance to Zephyrian occupation had inspired similar resistance movements on other Imperial worlds, and those movements were now using human innovation in interstellar communication to appeal for outside assistance. The galactic political situation was shifting in ways that threatened the fundamental basis of Imperial expansion. For 4 centuries, the Zephyrian Empire had expanded by conquering isolated species that had no means of appealing for outside assistance. Humans had demonstrated that technological isolation could be overcome through persistence and innovation. "Sir," reported his strategic analysis team, "we are detecting similar resistance patterns emerging on 14 other Imperial worlds. Subject species are implementing human tactical innovations and attempting to establish contact with galactic civilization." The contagion of human resistance was spreading throughout Imperial space faster than suppression efforts could contain it. Worse, the tactical innovations that humans had developed for fighting technologically superior enemies were being adapted by species with different capabilities and different technological advantages. "They have created a blueprint for resisting Imperial authority that any species can implement," Kethvar's analyst explained. "Human tactical doctrine is being studied and modified by resistance movements throughout Imperial territory." As the crisis deepened, Kethvar received a transmission that forced him to confront the ultimate implications of the human resistance campaign. It came from the Corvin Confederacy flagship, but it carried the authority of a formal galactic diplomatic declaration. "Commander Kethvar, the species present in this system are issuing a formal notice under galactic law regarding territorial sovereignty. The Zephyrian Empire's claims over inhabited worlds will no longer be recognized by galactic civilization unless those claims are based on voluntary consent of the governed populations. Any attempt to continue occupation of Earth or other inhabited worlds without such consent will be considered an act of aggression against galactic civilization itself." The declaration was signed by representatives of over 60 different galactic civilizations, indicating that human resistance had succeeded in creating the largest diplomatic coalition in recorded galactic history. The Zephyrian Empire was no longer facing resistance from a single primitive species. It was facing organized opposition from the majority of known galactic civilization. "High Command," Kethvar transmitted, "the strategic situation has become untenable at the galactic level. Continued occupation of Earth will result in military conflict with a coalition of advanced civilizations whose combined capabilities far exceed Imperial resources." The response took several hours, during which Kethvar monitored increasing coordination between human resistance groups and alien observer fleets. Humans were not just receiving moral support from galactic civilization. They were receiving tactical intelligence, strategic advice, and technological assistance that was making their resistance efforts dramatically more effective. When the message from High Command finally arrived, it carried the authority of the Emperor himself. "Commander Kethvar, the Empire cannot allow the precedent of alien interference in Imperial sovereignty to establish itself. However, the galactic political situation requires consideration of strategic alternatives to direct occupation. You are authorized to negotiate temporary suspension of occupation operations pending resolution of territorial disputes through galactic diplomatic channels. The authorization was carefully worded to avoid any admission of defeat, but Kethvar understood what it meant. The Zephyrian Empire was withdrawing from Earth because humans had successfully made conquest politically and militarily unsustainable at the galactic level. Attention human resistance forces. Kethvar broadcast on all frequencies. Imperial forces will begin withdrawing from Earth pending resolution of territorial status through proper galactic diplomatic channels. Zephyrian personnel and equipment will be evacuated within 72 hours. Human populations will maintain current positions until evacuation is complete. The response from human resistance groups was immediate and characteristically defiant. Attention Zephyrian forces came to reply from resistance networks across the planet. Your evacuation timeline is accepted. Any Zephyrian forces remaining on Earth after the 72-hour deadline will be considered hostile and engaged accordingly. Even in victory, humans were maintaining the same aggressive posture that had characterized their resistance from the beginning. They were not celebrating the Zephyrian withdrawal. They were ensuring that Imperial forces understood that human vigilance would continue until the last alien soldier had left Earth. As evacuation operations began, Kethvar reviewed the final casualty and damage reports from the occupation campaign. Zephyrian forces had killed approximately 40 million humans and destroyed most of Earth's major urban centers. By any conventional measure, the campaign had been a devastating success that had eliminated the majority of human military capability and industrial capacity. But humans had accomplished something far more significant than military victory. They had demonstrated to every species in the galaxy that technological superiority could be overcome through persistence, innovation, and absolute refusal to accept defeat. They had proven that the cost of conquering a determined species could exceed the value of conquest regardless of technological advantages. Most importantly, they had established a precedent that would make imperial expansion infinitely more difficult. Every species that the Zephyrian Empire encountered in the future would know that resistance was possible, that help might be available, and that technological primitiveness did not guarantee defeat. "Sir," reported his communications officer as the evacuation continued, "we are receiving transmissions from across Imperial space. Subject species on 47 worlds are declaring independence from Imperial authority and appealing for recognition from galactic civilization." The human victory was cascading throughout Imperial territory faster than suppression efforts could respond. The psychological impact of Earth's successful resistance was inspiring similar movements across the entire empire, threatening to unravel 4 centuries of conquest in a matter of months. As his evacuation transport lifted off from Earth's scarred surface, Kethvar looked down at a planet that had taught the galaxy the most important lesson in military history. Sometimes the strongest weapon isn't technology or superior force. It's the absolute, terrifying refusal to surrender when everything rational says you should. The Zephyrian Empire had come to Earth expecting to conquer a primitive species. Instead, they had discovered why gods fear humans. Because humans are the species that climbs back up from hell just to spit in the faces of those who sent them there. Earth was free, but more importantly, the galaxy would never be the same. Humans had proven that freedom was not something that could be taken by force from those who valued it above life itself. And across the stars, countless other species were learning that lesson and beginning to remember what it meant to be free.